Now, William Lawrence is a former diplomat and also a professor at George W. University, or GWU University, George Washington University, here in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us on TRT World. Now, firstly, this is quite an achievement for those who took to the streets that called for Mr. Bouteflika to not continue. Despite the fact that there's no sign of an election coming up, they're still left in the dark. But what else is there at play here, apart from protesters just not wanting to accept the status quo?
Well, first of all, we have to say these are the largest protest crowds we've seen in Algeria in 60 years, since 62, according to those who've watched it that long, like some of my colleagues who've been in this field a lot longer than I have. And these crowds basically had two goals. One was to stop the fifth term for the president, and the other was to change the system. A not very ambitious goal and a very ambitious goal. That first goal was achieved today much more quickly than most people imagine, and that's because we had so many millions of Algerians in the streets. But changing the system when the crowds are disorganized, there's a NGO no one has heard of that's sort of leading it called Muatana. The political parties have been on the sidelines. There's civil societies in a bit of disarray. And for years now, the main political action in Algeria has been street protests, regime concessions, because it's a rich state, hydrocarbon state, and they just concede to the crowd enough to keep the social peace. Because of that dynamic, there's really no clear way forward. So, for example, they're talking about a national conference, which will lead to a constitution, which will lead to elections. But we have no idea when that conference will happen, who will be in charge, who will be invited. And so in many ways, there's an opportunity here for ambitious politicians to sort of grab hold of the situation. And then the question is, will these crowds support whoever steps up, not support them? So there's more questions than answers right now.
Tell us a little bit about the history behind the system. Bouteflika has done some things in terms of demilitarizing Algeria. Yeah. He's also accepted some moderate Islamists into the political arena. Yeah. Has that made for a fairly weak power system within the country? And where does that come from?
Well, I think the simplest way to say it is you have a regime in Algeria that's very wealthy because of the hydrocarbon riches. They're the fifth largest gas exporter in the world and among the top 20 in oil production. And they have a system whereby they use coercive measures and co-optive measures to maintain control. This has been a system that's been in place since the 60s. There have been many challenges, including the civil war of the 90s. And Bouteflika emerged in 1999 as the figure in the regime who was pushing forward the reconciliation between, let's say, secular Algeria and Islamic Algeria, or Islamist Algeria, following the war. What happened in the subsequent years, though, is he was unable to get full control over the security services and the military, and there were several attempts at purges. And as these purges went forward, he sided more and more with what they call the eradicator wing of the military over the reconciler wing of the military and security forces, and this put him in a weaker position vis-a-vis the population, which had elected him at the beginning on this reconciliationist stance. So all of that means that people are now ready for change. One of the things that happened today is they did a ministerial reshuffle and just put the same old people in new chairs. And this is clearly going to be one of the things Algerians will be back out protesting at the end of the week.
Well, things are obviously starting to shift already, but it doesn't stop at the ballot box. How can they ensure that there's going to be a fair and legitimate polling practice and that the correct president will come to power?
Well, there's a lot in your question. How do you run free and fair elections? I've been an election observer, and elections are about the months before the election, how the campaign is run, who gets to be a candidate. Already in this election, there are people saying, well, they shouldn't have canceled the election. But already we had one of the leading opposition candidates, Rachid Nekez, blocked because of a dual citizenship problem, even though he'd renounced his French citizenship. So he put up his cousin with the same name, Rachid Nekez, who was going to present in the elections. And one observer called this a sort of a Monty Python election, And the leading opposition candidates, Ali Ben Flis, who was former prime minister, Louisa Hanoum, the head of the Worker Party. They'd already dropped out. And so I don't know how they could organize elections on those grounds. And then the question is, if you're going to organize elections, how quickly and on what basis? Are we going to have a new constitution and a referendum on that first? So the Algerian population wants quick changes, but they don't even know what order they want them in. And so instead, the regime is presiding over a transition that it won't accept to knock itself out of power. So a lot remains to be determined.
Okay, well, the population have proven that they can create some change at least. We appreciate your time, William Lawrence there, Professor at George Washington University. Thank you.